Hi, everybody. Joe Vertenis with you, your professor. Going to work on Chapter 7. This is the lecture for Chapter 7, Movies and the Impact of Images. To get us started, and I'm going to try to be fairly quick on this one, keep it to about half an hour. But to get us started, I want to talk a little bit about the introduction in your book talks about Disney and how they acquired a number of companies beginning in 1996. So one of the biggest ones it talked about is Star Wars, which was a major blockbuster that came out in 1977, about 2 years after a major blockbuster called Jaws, which was 1975. It was a film by George Lucas, and George Lucas George Lucas's film Lucas, or his production company Lucasfilm, was acquired by Disney in 2012 for $4 billion. So Disney now has a portfolio that is world class, and the content includes Star Wars, which is one of the greatest family entertainment film franchises of all time, as well as many unique and unparalleled creative executions across multiple forms in businesses and markets. So, what do they have to offer? Of course, we mentioned Lucasfilm 2012, but back in 1996, they bought Capital Cities and ABC, and this was when ESPN was guns ablaze, and they were just becoming a huge entertainment network, and they bought that ABC. And the biggest reason I think they wanted to buy that was ESPN. So if you're watching college football on a weekend, or you're watching Monday Night Football in the NFL, you're actually watching a Disney property. So then they started to buy things like Pixar, which was a separate animation company. If you remember the movies Toy Story and Toy Story 2, Pixar was that animation. So they bought them for 7.6 billion in 06, and then in 09 they bought the Marvel Comics line with the Avengers, Iron Man, Guardians of the Galaxy, etc. And then after Lucasfilms, the purchase of that in 2012, they bought 20th Century Fox and Fox Searchlight, which is now 20th Century Studios and Searchlight Pictures. So Hollywood's big six are now the big five: Warner Brothers, Paramount, Universal, Columbia Pictures, and now Disney. Just a little history about the development of film. In the 17th century, the early precursor to film was something called magic lantern shows, and you can see a little picture of that there on the screen. They projected an image painted on glass plates using oil lamps as a light source. And then the thaumatrope was invented in 1824. This was a two-sided card with different images on each side, which you see on your screen. There's the pumpkin and the sort of ghoul there. And it appeared, the images appeared to combine the images when twirled, which was kind of the very precursor to moving pictures and film. And then the zoetrope in 1834 was introduced, and this was a cylindrical device that rapidly twirled images in a cylinder and appeared to make the images move. So we started to see these early inventions that were the precursors to film. Now, what are some milestones? Edward Maybridge was a English photographer who was living in America, and he was the first to actually project these moving pictures. In 1878, he determined that running horses actually lift all four legs off the ground. He had set up to 12 cameras at a time, and used a spinning cylinder to project those photos on the wall. And as the cylinder went around, he saw that the horses, all four of their feet came up at the same time. And then around the same time, George Eastman, who, if you grew up in my day, you would know him very well, because everything related around photography and film was related to a company called Kodak Eastman. Eastman Kodak, pardon me, I reversed that. And he developed the first roll film. The backing had to be peeled away. This was a huge improvement over the old way of doing this, which was metal glass plates that were used for making individual photos. In 1889, Hannibal Goodwin, a New Jersey minister, then took Eastman's film to the next level and improved upon it. He used these thin strips of celluloid And this invention solved a major problem. In rapid succession, you could do it. You could produce a series of pictures that moved in rapid succession because it holds, and the film also is called celluloid because it holds this coating of sensitive materials. Celluloid is transparent except for the image made on it during filming. So this was a very big invention and could actually be projected. So there was a patent battle between Eastman and Goodwin, and eventually Eastman won that, lost that patent battle to Goodwin, but Eastman won the commercialization of film. Goodwin is credited with the invention, but the courts ruled that Eastman would be technically allowed to buy all the patents. So the patent battle was won, and off and running. Eastman's name is more associated probably with the invention of the celluloid film than Goodwin, but Goodwin actually did invent it, and then Eastman commercialized it, basically. Okay, moving on. So Edison, in the late 1800s, Thomas Edison directed his assistant William Kennedy Dixon to combine his invention of the incandescent light bulb with this celluloid film from Goodwin and motion picture camera. And that was developed by Louis Aime Augustin Leprince, and that's a hard one to some of the French names are a little harder to say. And this was done by this individual to create an early movie camera, the kinetograph, and then the kinetoscope was invented, and this was a single person viewing system. In 1984, the parlors for this started to open. And the first two rows of these parlors were rows of coin-operated machines, and they opened on Broadway. So this is really the precursor here to these early movie theaters. Edison then manufactured something called a Vitascope, and this was a large screen viewing system, and the first show was in 1896. And then the Lumiere brothers in France invented the cinematograph, and this was a camera system with a camera, film developer, and projector system. More than one person could watch at a time, and in December 1895, there was a public first paid public show. So now we're starting in the development of film and the development of movie theaters. We're starting to enter into the entrepreneurial stage. Okay. So a key shift here early on in the development of movies was the introduction of the narrative, and the shift was for movies really to move into the mass media stage, and that really began with the introduction of these narrative films, and essentially these are movies that tell stories. A narrative moves away from single continuous camera shots to these multiple angles and editing. So in the early days of film, very wide shots, very, everything included in the shot, but not many close-ups and not editing to shift to different angles, etc. So early narrative filmmakers included Georges Méliès. He's a French magician, inventor, and he opened his first public movie theater in France. He experimented with editing, cartoon animation, fantasy, and slow motion, and began producing short fantasy and fairy tale films. For example, 1902's A Trip to the Moon. And then a guy named Edwin S. Porter, an American filmmaker, adopted his inventions, Méliès's inventions. And in 1902, he made what is regarded basically as America's first narrative film, The Life of an American Fireman. He followed that up in 1903 with the Great Train Robbery. And this really introduced the Western drama, the Western genre, and these chase scenes where you would have someone running and then you would see the people running after him and then you would see someone running. And this was very revolutionary at the time. 11-minute film, it introduced this art of suspense, these alternate shots of the good guys and the bad guys. And then the Life of American Fireman contained the first close-up in American history, first close-up shot, and it was a ringing fire bell. And you could start to see, you know, as someone who's written videos and things in my career, when we would write videos, we'd always call for these types of shots in the script. So we're not necessarily making movies with these videos, but we would say, hey, we're going to show an example of a fireman doing his job, but it would be really nice to show this close-up of the bell ringing as it goes off. And you see this a lot in television shows today, especially action adventure shows. So the arrival of Nickelodeons, and many of you may be familiar with the television station Nickelodeon. I never knew what that was when I was a kid, but I did learn about it as I got into studying mass media. Nickelodeons were a form of movie theater whose name combines the admissions price, a nickel, with the Greek word for theater. They were cheap and easy to set up. Basically, you needed a secondhand projector and a sheet. They grew from 5,000 to 10,000 from 1907 to 1909. And the name combines the admission price with the Greek word for theater, which I just said. Sorry, I reread that again. My apologies. They were often these converted storefronts. And they featured live music at the time that were played by piano players. These really did transcend language barriers. At the time, you had a lot of European migration. Not everyone spoke English, but they could definitely enjoy these movies because they didn't really have to deal with the sound barriers. So they peaked by 1910, and movies became a major industry. Producers started seeking more affluent viewers in lavish theaters, and we started to move away from these Nickelodeons. I'll talk a little bit about how the Hollywood studio system and how that came about. By the 1900s, movies had really become a major industry. And among the first to really try to dominate the movie business and reap its profits was none other than somebody we've mentioned a ton of times, Thomas Edison. And he was all over the place. So Edison started what was called the Motion Picture Patents Company. It was known as the Trust. It was basically a cartel of US and French producers. And they pooled their patents to control film technology and fees to use the equipment. And Edison snatched up major film distributorships, and he signed a deal with Eastman, who then agreed to supply him with movie film only to these trust-approved companies. Independent productions started to move to Hollywood to escape the trust. So this is where this Hollywood really started to emerge. Southern California had great weather, it had great scenery, and if you watch a ton of films that you think look like they should be in Arizona, they should be in even Florida or even in Texas, if that's where they're set, they're actually being filmed in California because it has so many different types of scenery and the weather is perfect for filming all year round. They could also slip down to Mexico to avoid prosecution by the Trust for patent violations. The Trust was based in New Jersey, and at that time, this was a very successful way of avoiding those. Adolf Zukor, he figured out ways to bypass the Trust, and he actually went on to run Paramount Pictures. A 1917 suit by William Fox actually led to the breakup of the Trust, and then Fox went on to found the Fox Film Corp, which later became 20th Century Fox, now 21st Century Fox. The lawsuit resulted in the trust breakup due to what was called restraint of trade violations in 1917. But these two Hungarian immigrants were very, very pivotal in the breakup of this trust and the emergence of the Hollywood studio system we know today. Whoops. Sorry. Jumping around here a little bit. So then they went on to develop other tactics for controlling the industry. So they managed to break up the trust, but then they developed their own tactics so they could control it. It's capitalism at its finest. So vertical integration. That was a huge way to dominate all the essential levels. Essentially, vertical integration is dominating all levels of an industry. And so how they tried to execute vertical integration was by dominating production. They secured the script, the actors, they raised the money, they did the filming, the distribution, they did block booking. They made exhibitors agree to rent new or marginal films with no stars in order to just get access to the popular films that starred very popular actors like a woman named Mary Pickford. And they also controlled the exhibition of the films. They bought up all the theaters. By 1921, Paramount owned 300 theaters across the country. If you were in a major city, Toledo, one of the biggest theaters downtown was the Paramount Theater. They were all over the place. So, and these were grandiose halls in the middle of the downtowns of the bustling downtowns of cities as they were in those days. So at this time, the exhibition aspect of it, by buying up all the theaters, the Zucker and other entrepreneurs were able to show just the movies that they produced at those theaters. The result was an oligopoly. A few films controlled the bulk of the business, and it was spawned by this vertical integration that gave these studios such great power. Skip over this one and move to the next one because I'm trying to keep it a little short, so we'll just skip over the slide about that goes into a little bit more detail about production. So be sure to read these lectures are meant to give you a really solid overview of the PowerPoint that I provide you, but there is a lot more detail in the book. So the introduction of set. Prior to 1927, there were all silent films. The Jazz Singer in 1927 was the first talkie. It was a racist film, and by racist, it featured Al Jolson. And he was a popular vaudeville singer who he wore blackface and makeup as part of his act. So he wore blackface in this, and blackface was when a white male would paint his face black and sort of portray a black individual. So racist in that sense. In those days, looking back at it, we can see that it definitely was, but in those days, it probably wasn't seen that way as much by a lot of people, but it was definitely seen that way by others. It featured just 354 spoken words, but the audiences were in awe of the dialogue and stood and cheered those 357 words. The Singing Fool was another popular talkie starring Jolson. And then, so we had the advent of these talkies with these vaudeville guys, and then we went into the newsreels. So Movie Tone, actually before that is when the newsreels premiered, just a few years before the talkies. So they were kind of a precursor to the Jazz Singer coming out. The Fox Studio premiered these newsreels, and they were the first film footage with sound. They captured the first film of Charles Lindbergh's takeoff and landing of his flight. And the sound was recorded in this narrow area of the film strip, which eventually became the standard for sound for movies. And the Hollywood style, thanks to the studio system, it features now the narrative, the genre, and the director as the author. So this is a very important concept. The right blend of these ingredients combined with timing, marketing, and a lot of luck has led to very many movie hits. And then we'll hear a little bit more about, I think, Al Jolson a little bit later in the slideshow. We're going to move just past this one and move to, I wanted to definitely make sure I covered a couple slides here about the Hollywood 10. So there's some sections in your book about inside the Hollywood system and outside the Hollywood system. Make sure you read those sections. I'm not going to cover those today because, again, I'm trying to keep these brief and keep them to about 30 minutes. After years of thriving, this Hollywood movie industry really began to falter after 1946. And there were a number of factors involved, but by 1963, the decline was down. Was down to 25 million per week for attendance. It peaked at 90 million in 1946. One of the big factors was the end of this vertical integration system, and then suburbanization. So what was happening in the late 1940s was the baby boom, and post World War II, all of the baby boomers were being born, the biggest generation known to man, and all of these service members were coming back home, and they were all moving out to the suburbs. So what was in the suburbs? Not a lot, but it certainly wasn't the theater. So as I think about where the Toledo area where I grew up, the downtown is centered around the river. Used to be a lot of all the shops and the big department stores and the movie theaters, and then this is when that suburban expansion happened, and so a lot of people were not on top of those theaters anymore, and there weren't yet theaters built out in the suburbs. Another factor was, and your book spends a lot of time on this, so I wanted to make sure I covered it, was the communist witch hunts, as well as TV and home video. So communist witch hunts, in 1947, there was a committee in Congress called the House of Un-American Activities Committee. And they had allegations of subversive and communist ties in Hollywood. And these were very, very well known. Actually, if you go back and read books about former President Ronald Reagan, which I've done, he was quite involved in a lot of this rooting out of communism that people felt had infiltrated Hollywood. So the HUAC coerced prominent people in the film industry to declare their patriotism and give up the names of colleagues. This was a time, and I will say, even in the 70s and 80s, there was still this huge fear of communism as the Soviet Union really continued to expand, and communism was spreading across the country. This was more of the infancy of that, and there was a lot of fear back in those days. And in Hollywood, it really did impact the film industry. Those who refused to identify folks who had sympathized with communism were identified themselves as communist sympathizers, and they were charged with contempt and imprisoned. They were subsequently blacklisted by major studios upon their release. And again, Gary Cooper, a famous actor, Ronald Reagan, a famous actor who would become president of the United States, and Walt Disney were among those that named names of folks that they thought were communist sympathizers. Surely there were communist sympathizers in Hollywood, and surely there were folks that did get caught up in this who were not communist sympathizers. But it was a very big deal, and it greatly impacted Hollywood. A man named Dalton Trumbo won 2 Oscars while he was blacklisted. And he wrote under a pseudonym. But for the most part, it really did impact a lot of these producers and screenwriters in Hollywood. So I talked earlier about the end of vertical integration. So coinciding with the House of Un-American Activities Committee activities and the investigations into all of these folks who were in Hollywood who had supposed communist ties. There were investigations by the mid-40s, 1940s, on vertical integration. So, which again was the controlling of production, distribution, exhibition, this oligopoly. The Supreme Court ruled against the film industry in 1948 in what became known as the Paramount decision. The studios then had to divest themselves of all of those theaters. So I mentioned all those grand, wonderful theaters that were in the downtowns of all these cities. Paramount, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, MGM, RKO all had to divest themselves of all of those theaters, so they no longer had the income from controlling the exhibition of these films. It was meant to increase competition. It was affirmed by the Supreme Court in 1948, but it never really changed the oligopoly structure of the Hollywood film industry. Studios still controlled the distribution and production, but they just didn't control the exhibition. It did, however, create a lot more opportunities for exhibition, and you saw many more art houses and drive-in theaters that were throughout the countryside. They were all over the place. I remember growing up in Toledo, and we had them all in the outskirts of farm fields, etc. So you also had these art houses that were springing up in downtown areas and other places as well. So there were other opportunities that were created by this. Okay, so sorry, I had to step away. I don't know if that messed up the recording at all. My dog was wanting to go outside and not being very helpful to me while I'm trying to record a lecture here. The fun of online teaching sometimes. So excuse me. So the next title of this next slide is Television Changes Hollywood. But really, the move to the suburbs that I mentioned earlier was one of the most dramatic things that happened to the movie industries first, because it was really that very dramatic drop post World War II baby boom in the late 1940s, when this move to the suburbs and away from the theaters really started all of this. Now, granted, a lot of theaters were then built out in the suburbs, but it really wasn't this thing of everyone living in and around downtown and going downtown to these grandiose, beautiful theaters. But there were some adjustments that the industry would make as well, and we'll talk about a little bit about those. But TV did have a tremendous impact by the 1950s, especially the mid 1950s, because it really became, as we mentioned in the previous chapters, the primary family entertainment center of the home. Everybody centered around the TV. The movie industry had to respond to this. So you no longer had people living in the suburbs. They had televisions. They didn't live downtown where the theaters were, and they're staying at home and watching TV. The movies industry response was to create more serious subject matter that really explored a lot of social problems, etc. That TV really wasn't. They're trying to differentiate by not showing the same kind of stuff that was going on TV. And movies provided an outlet for that because it was a longer format and there was a lot more production put into them. So alcoholism, racism, teen angst, rebellion, sexuality. And then we started to tackle a lot of topics that were going a little bit beyond things that anyone had ever really seen. So when we talk about some of these topics, they're a bit risque for the times. So especially the 1950s. But the theaters also came out with these new technologies of Technicolor and 3D. 3D was a little clunky back in the day. You had to wear these 3D glasses, and sometimes they still have that, but not like it used to be. So the widescreen format boom happened in the 1950s too. You had Cinerama, CinemaScope, VistaVision, and these featured these striking widescreen images with multiple projectors that were synchronized and stereophonic sound. And then Panavision eventually became this standard for the widescreen. Talk a little bit about the economics of the movie business. So movies are still big business. These major films are getting more and more expensive. 80 to 90% of them actually fail to make money. But on average, it's $66 million to produce a film, $37 million to then promote the film. So the studios need these big blockbusters because they need that one blockbuster that makes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to offset the losses that they're facing from a lot of the other movies that don't make money. There's 6 major sources of income for the studios. There's box office receipts. 40% goes to the studio. The rest goes back to the theater. And again, they don't own the theaters anymore. So the theaters separate companies. So 60% of those box office receipts are not going to the studios. DVD sales, rentals, streaming, and downloads. These all tend to occur 3 to 4 minutes after the release of a movie. Sometimes they do direct release. During COVID, we actually experienced some of that where they said, hey, we're just going to take this straight to Netflix or something like that. They do make money off premium cable, basic cable, and television. In foreign markets, they also make money off distributing indie films. The studios get 30 to 50% of that revenue. And then licensing and product placement have become a very, very big deal. So Pepsi was really one of the first ones to be featured as product placement in a movie back in 1989. And you can see Pepsi being drunk there by an actor. So that was actually the Goonies. So that was a different movie by Warner Brothers. But here in the late 1980s is where you really started to see these product placements. Earlier in 1982, we saw Reese's being featured in the movie E.T., which was a major blockbuster. So these brands want to get into these movies, and they know that if it's going to be a major blockbuster, they want to have their brands front and center. If you look back at a lot of these movies back at that time that weren't sort of catching up to the trend, and even in television, I was watching, I don't know if you're familiar with 90210. There was a reboot of it that was pretty popular, but the original show ran in the early 90s. And I always watch it with my wife, and we make fun of how, oh, that's obviously a Pepsi, but they've altered it so it doesn't look like a Pepsi. So they weren't making any money off product placement in a lot of these areas. But these days, every time you turn on a TV show or a movie, you're seeing the actual brands and the actual products. So very interesting little take on product placement. Alternative voices, digital video came around, and you no longer had to record on digital or on celluloid film if you didn't want to. I actually was at the front end of this in the back in the late 1990s, I want to say early 2000s. You were able to began to record digitally. Before that, you could record on videotape and go straight to video. That was less expensive than film, but digital video really became way cheaper and more accessible than the standard film equipment. And you saw, and then you had the ability to promote online and on social media. So this all started to change with the late 1990s into the 2000s. There's a movie called Paranormal Activity, which was released in 2009, which took $11,000 to make and grossed $190 million. And I'll never forget the Blair Witch Project, because this was basically done by a handheld camera, and they and people were kind of okay with the fact that it was, hey, it's these guys out here in the woods with this handheld camera. It kind of added to the film. It took $60,000 to make, but it grossed $250 million worldwide and was picked up by a major major film studio. So a lot more opportunities for these films to get out there, because when the Blair Witch Project came out, there wasn't really Netflix, there was no streaming. So now some of these individual alternative projects created on digital video can get sold to the likes of Netflix and Amazon Prime and go straight to streaming as well. So that's it for this chapter. I did skip over a few slides. There were a few slides that I also took out because I wanted to keep this under 20 slides. Wanted to really keep this recording to as close to a half an hour as I could. Be sure to read the chapter. There's always so much more in there, but I do these because there are some parts of the chapter that I really, really want to highlight and go over with you so that you can see me and see my face and listen to some of my commentary on explaining a lot of this stuff, because these are really the most important things, but there are other things that are on the test and in the chapters. And that's why we do all the exercises and all of the discussion posts and the assignments and et cetera, because there's a lot to cover in mass media, and we only have about 15 weeks to do it. So that's it. Have a great week. And that's it for chapter 7.